Hey, Rhys. So, we are going to go on to chapter 7 of The Faceless Old Woman Who Secretly Lives in Your Home by Joseph Fink and Jeffrey Craner. My father's plan was uncharacteristically violent, but he was willing to do what had to be done. Quitting smuggling would not save him, and my father refused to join the Duke's own because he did not want his family name tied to their ruthlessness and violence. More than death, my father feared his only daughter used as collateral against him, or worse, herself forced into a life of banditry and murder. So he had his plan. A fake shipment, he said. Here, a few miles down the coast. A cove very similar to ours, and next to dense, wooded land. Almost as good a place to bring ashore goods as our own. We staged a smuggling operation there and allow the order to see us set it up. Won't they be suspicious that we have moved our receiving port? Edmund asked. Yes, but we will assuage them. No, will assuage that suspicion on two fronts. Firstly, we will pay off one of the smaller royal boats with whose crew we are friendly, and to loiter in the waters near our cove, providing a pretext for the move. And secondly, we will move all our operations there, starting now. Once they see that this has become a regular place for us, they will accept it as the new status quo. Then, he continued, we will hide a full regiment of mercenaries in the shipment. When the order of the labyrinth comes, our hired men will spring out and strike back mercilessly. The order of the labyrinth has many ships, said Edmund. Even if our attack succeeds, they will be back with more soon. Their interest is secrecy, said my father, and that secrecy is better served by picking on weaker operations first, rather than waging all-out war with the powerful. Otherwise, it would be common knowledge, even to the armies of the kingdoms and empires, that this order has become a warring state and must be crushed. So, it is in our interest to establish a tone of difficulty. We strike first, and we strike with overwhelming brutality. When they understand that to approach us is to invite fierce, visible violence, they will move on to easier, smaller targets. Edmund did not speak for several moments. Then, you believe this will work? Yes. It's risky, said Edmund. You are dead set against joining the Duke's own? It will never be an option. Okay, Edmund conceded after a contemplative silence. I will go about arranging the decoy, royal patrol, and the mercenaries right away. Good. We keep a lookout at all times above the new location, and we board the mercenaries nearby. When we see the ship coming, we set up a fake shipment and prepare for their arrival. Edmund shook his head thoughtfully. I hope you realize the stakes here. If we fail or falter at all, they will crush us. They will crush us if we do nothing as well, said my father. He looked at me, and the sight of his daughter seemed to harden his resolve. I don't know if we'll succeed, but I know that we must try. Struggling, and finding only a small part of his usual laughter, Edmund raised his glass. Here is to our attempt. But I must help, I said, or more likely, I whined. I hated that tone in my voice, but I couldn't help the rising feelings of helplessness and fury. This is my family, too. This is what keeps both of us fed. You must let me help. My father raised an eyebrow, sighed, and motioned me to sit next to him. It had been some days, and smuggling operations had been transferred for the moment to the new spot miles down the shore. From our cliffs, I could see the ships come and go from the new cove, but it was also frustratingly distant. I have been trying to teach you what it is to live a life of crime, he said, and much of that is understanding and managing risk. Those who rush blindly in are first to fall or get caught or otherwise come up against misfortune. You must choose wisely when you put yourself in danger. One miscalculation could be the end of it all. But inaction could also be the end, I said. True, but we are acting. Edmund is managing the operation. Our mercenaries are in place. All that can be done is being done. Nothing about either of us being there or not being there would change how this will turn out. The only thing it could change is the length of our lives. Still, I could not be convinced. And what I felt was shame. I felt that my father was a coward and that he was forcing me also to be a coward while others did the brave work of preserving our lives. My father, seeing this resentment in my eyes, led me to the window from which we could see where my mother was buried. A view neither of us ever acknowledged or talked about, but this time he gestured toward her. I have a responsibility, he said. And my responsibility isn't to be the most wealthy or cunning or brave. It isn't conquer the world. It's to see that you flourish, not as a criminal, nor someone indebted in life to criminals, but as a good woman. That is what I owe your mother. That is what I owe you. That is what I owe myself. Maybe you don't understand this now. Maybe you never will. You will resent me forever for my caution, but none of those things will change the truth of my debt. He turned me away from the window. Now, he said, what should I make for dinner? Of course, that night I went quietly out of my bedroom and quietly through the house, quietly out the door, and then abandoning quiet, tearing through the grass toward the shore cliffs and the ambush point ahead. It would happen soon, perhaps that night, and I needed to be there. It's not that I didn't understand my father's warning. It's that despite my understanding, my faith in what was right would not let me do otherwise. The night was warm, summer peering over the horizon of spring. Bright, too, a full moon turning the nighttime into slightly faded day. I could see the coast for a mile ahead of me and the white caps of the waves breaking against it. If I had thought about it, I would have realized what a strange night that would have been for the Order of the Labyrinth to attack, when the cover of darkness isn't dark. But I was not thinking. I was believing. I believed in my father and his righteousness. I believed in Edmund and his ability. I believed that our plan was foolproof. I believed in myself and my cunning, and most of all, I believed that my time had come. Too long had I been a child, hiding behind the work of my father. It was time for my name to be known, for my face to be remembered. I would be my own person in this world of smugglers and thieves, and they would know who I was. All of this went through my head as I, a child still, ran barefoot through that night until I had arrived, panting, at the shoreline where Edmund stood, hands on hips, waiting to see if the night was the night he would face attack. He turned at my approach, and his face passing through confusion and shock and worry. "What are you thinking?" he said. "You must get home at once." I was already speaking, already pleading my cause, my legacy too. And when I'm old and looking back, I don't want to have to be hiding in my bedroom. It's time for me to take responsibility. It's time for me to help. You think so too. You said so. And I'm just doing what you said, but I'm also what I chose to do because that's what means to grow up. And I'm grown up, and can I help? I have sharper eyes than all the rest of you. I'll be able to see them coming from further away. Let me stay, please, Uncle Edmund, please. It had all sounded so much more dignified and eloquent in my head. Within me was a great general surveying her troops, speaking in stirring words, and it made me cringe to open my mouth and hear a child whining for approval. But Edmund heard the noble foundation under my mewling words, and he nodded thoughtfully. Or, more likely, he looked back at the night-shrouded coast and thought through the calculus of sending a child back on her own versus keeping her somewhat safe nearby. "Okay," he said, "you can stay." He pointed up at the cliff, well out of the way, but up there. "You keep an eye out and shout the moment you see ships." I did not understand, or chose not to understand, the rationale of keeping me out of harm's way, but I nodded sternly, a soldier on a mission, and I ran, grateful and ashamed of my gratitude, up to the cliff. The night would have been kind of quiet, beautiful night that I liked to watch from the window of my bedroom, the hiss of the waves and the wind through the trees harmonizing, and the world turned by the bright moon into softer, bluer version of itself, permeated with all the smell of night blooming flowers. But now there was a sense of threat and danger under all of the beauty, and it felt like the ocean itself was pounding as hard as my own heart. I strained my eyes, watching the seas, determined that if I was to be relegated to this cliff, then I would certainly be the first one to see the oncoming ships, and it would be those few minutes of extra advance notice my young eyes provided that would make all of the difference in setting up our ambush. The line between success and failure would be drawn by my decision to come out this night. If another lookout saw the ships before me, then it was true that I was only a nuisance, an extra concern for Edmund on a night when he already had more than enough. Try as I might, I could see no ships at all on the calm sea. The men sat around the fire on the bench, laughing and chatting. Edmund stood apart from them, staring at nothing in particular, his arms crossed and frowning. He occasionally looked up at the moon, tracking the progress of the night. He was more worried than I expected him to be, and it occurred to me that perhaps I had underestimated just how dangerous this position was. Perhaps I should return to my bed. But no, I was no coward. And if I wanted to be counted in this world, then I needed the courage to stand up and be counted. Hours passed. I could feel myself start to waver into sleep. There were no ships coming that night. Perhaps the ships would never come. Perhaps they had found a more worthy target, and we could go back to our usual business. And years later, think back and laugh about this week where we all became so worried about the great attack that never came. This thought made me happy, and I smiled sleepily. Then I shook my head and stood to wake up my body. Now was not time to fantasize about what could happen. Now was the time to focus on what was happening. I concentrated harder on searching the sea, hoping that this would make me awake. And it was in this sweep from my vantage that I happened to turn and look back in the direction of our estate. I cried out. Not anything as useful as words, but strangled, grunting sounds of someone who has been unexpectedly struck in the gut. Where the estate was, a thick, black column of smoke rose into the bright night sky. Chapter 8. Edmund and the rest must have heard my cry, but I did not wait to see their reaction or consult with them on what to do next. By the time I understood what I was doing, I was already flying across the edge of the cliffs, a hedge-long sprint toward my home. The closer I got, the more unmistakable it was that the smoke was from our estate. And where was my father? I wish I could run faster, that my spirit would fly from this too slow body and I could transform into an I could transform untethered into the physical world, but on that night I could only move on the length of my awkward teenage legs. When I rounded the last turn of the coast and the trees fell away, I saw my home burning. Those legs almost gave out on me. I stumbled and fell, my nose slamming painfully into the ground. I pulled myself up, tried to keep running at the same speed, but my ankle was twisted and I could only manage a limping jog. I cried out my father's name over and over, then I saw him. He was hunched over, perhaps hurt, but he was alive, and I began weeping out of sheer relief. It's you, was all I could manage, and I came up to him, but then I had already realized something was wrong. This was not my father. This was a familiar lurching figure, the one I had seen 3 times before. The figure turned toward me. The man's face was completely pale. His eyes and mouth twisted into a look of absolute shock and pain. The front of his shirt was wet with blood. He gasped, but couldn't seem to form words. There was something wrong with his throat or his lungs. He could only wheeze. I stumbled backward. He reached out, one hand toward me, and I ran around him, stifling a scream toward my burning home. But by the time I thought to look behind me, the man had disappeared. The attack had been swift and total. Doors knocked in, windows broken. The inside of the house was a pure inferno, and try as I might, I could not even get close to it, let alone inside. Drawn in ash all over the hollow, flame-filled entrances was an emblem I recognized very well. The sign of the Order of the Labyrinth. I called and called for my father, stumbling around the fields, the orange trees, the cove, but there was no sign of him, only violence everywhere I turned. Even the orange trees had been hacked at and burned, although their wet leaves and living wood only smoldered and smoked rather than cradling the bright bursts of flames the attackers must have hoped for. In despair at my inability to find my father, I stopped in a field and looked at the moon. The same bright, mute moon that had watched me run from the house just hours before. And I thought that drove me further into darkness. I started toward my mother's grave, atop a small hill overlooking the cove. Soon I came across a blood trail in the grass, and I started to run faster. And then, some 20 feet from her grave, I found the body of my father. All right. Next upload is going to be chapter 9. And I'll see you tomorrow.